Okay, thanks, Kim Corla. Excuse me, I'm a bit croaky. Smothered with a cold.
The vaccine today.
What?
I got the vaccine today.
I took a lot of Lemsip. Yeah, well, indeed, I made a special effort to be here because I feel that the finance bill deserves that attention, even if it isn't always given the attention that it deserves. Because the finance bill gives effect to the budget, or to many elements of the budget, and it is often in the detail of the finance bill that very, very significant things happen which have very real consequences for our society, but because of the nature of those, particularly taxation measures being very complex and technical, often nobody really gets it at the time. And indeed, I have to say, commend the Department of Finance officials and anybody else who worked on it for having to produce legislation like this. Whatever the consequences are, it's not their fault, that's policy decisions, but they have to give technical effect to it, and that's a pretty amazing task when you look at the complex detail of some of this bill, which I still haven't got my head around, and we're going to have to do quite a lot of study and scrutiny as we go into the committee stage to really see what it all means. But I just want to make a couple of general comments about what's at stake in terms of the budget, and then a couple of specific areas that the bill deals with or doesn't deal with. Now, I think for most ordinary people looking at the budget, they were completely underwhelmed, if not deeply disappointed at what the budget didn't do for the big social crises that face Irish society. Most obviously the housing crisis, the lack of council housing. Ceann Corla, it's just come out in the news that the homeless figures are up again. Another 171 people homeless, many of them children. So the situation after, what is it now, 2.5, 3 years of rebuilding Ireland, getting worse. An absolute shame and a scandal, a stain on our society, makes a mockery of the claims of economic success and recovery when we have historic levels of people and children living in emergency accommodation, and no sign that that's going to abate. The utter failure to build council housing, to control a private market that is out of control in terms of rents and property prices, all of that, and a huge protest prior to the budget which pleaded with the government to make a radical change in policy and to allocate sufficient dramatic increase in resources to provide council and affordable housing. That wasn't dealt with. The health crisis, some extra money given, but mostly to deal with an overrun in a health service that is completely crumbling, and where we have, shocking statistics and human stories in terms of waiting for basic operations, scoliosis, hips, cataracts, lack of home care packages that are given to people, but they're not actually given to people. You can go through the list of failures in the health service. Something that wasn't talked about, but I've mentioned quite a few times since the budget, is the very worrying situation in third-level education, which has been highlighted by the Association of Universities, who are deeply worried about the dramatic increase in numbers going into third-level education not being matched by increased investment in third-level education, both in capital and in terms of per student investment in education, where Ireland is already at the bottom of the league table effectively in terms of Europe, in terms of the amount of investment that goes in per student in third-level education. Our universities are tumbling down the international rankings in third-level education. And students will certainly tell you, and that's why many of them are out on the streets protesting, that student poverty is rampant. So we're not, that's not just if you like, a case of injustice and hardship for students and teachers, but actually that is a real threat to Ireland as an economy. Climate change, huge fines coming down the line, and nothing really significant in climate change. So on basic things that you would think, you know, if you're trying to judge what a budget is trying to address and trying to judge its impact, you'd say, my God, you don't get much more basic than housing, health, education, and climate change, and on all of them, it fails. Doesn't do anything significant on any of those areas. Now, where all of this relates, that general perception and correct perception of the budget relates to this document, the finance bill, is because, of course, when you say to the government, we need more investment, dramatic increases of investment, as some of us on this side would propose, in these areas, the government says we just don't have the money. We just don't have the money. In your ideal world, Deputy Boyd Barrett, Taoiseach Varadkar would often say, you know, we do all these things, but we just don't have the money. Now, you see, that's the big lie, that we just don't have the money. We do just have the money. Ireland is wealthier than it has ever been. The level of economic growth would tell you that, wouldn't it? I mean, we have spectacular record levels of economic growth, outpacing anybody else in Europe, but we're not feeling it in the basic things. So where's the money going? Well, of course we know, don't we? It's going in enormous profits to vulture funds, to banks, to property speculators, to landlords, and to corporations who are absolutely making mind-boggling profits. Mind-boggling. The figures are so staggering, they don't even mean anything to people because there's so many zeros after the profits that they're making. But to put it in simple terms, in the time that you have been in government, pre-tax corporate profits have doubled. Doubled! They've gone from 77 billion a year to 144 billion. That's on the latest available figures, which are 2 years out of date, so it's probably even greater than that. And they are paying pitifully low levels of tax. And one of the features of the budget, I tweeted it on the day, was a measure in the budget mentioned by Pascal Donoghue, an anti-avoidance measure, which was going to generate, Count Corla, guess how much extra revenue? Anti-tax avoidance measure. It was actually in the budget book. Zero. That's how serious the government takes anti-avoidance when we know that there is just rampant tax avoidance going on with these multinationals over issues like intangible assets, when we have accusations, and I'm going to get onto this in a minute, in the film industry of abuse of tax reliefs, when we know that the property sector is benefiting from enormous tax relief, and we even have pressure to give more tax reliefs for landlords and vulture funds. We have the absolutely shocking scandal of Section 1110, which I just keep talking about, because the government cannot even tell us, and I asked Pascal Donoghue again, the Budget Scrutiny Committee, Minister, could you tell us how much tax revenue is foregone through Section 1110, a tax relief given to property investors who came in here, invested at the bottom of the market, who have now seen the value of their investment go through the roof in terms of rents and values of property, and who are going to pay no tax under Section 1110 on the rental revenue that they make as long as they keep their investment for 7 years, and on the capital gains. Can the government tell us how much revenue has gone on that? And you just think what's happening in property, can't tell us. Can't estimate it. Don't know how much tax revenue is gone. Imagine giving a tax relief like that. Jesus Christ, the property developers must love this place. Must absolutely love it. Where else would you get it? A tax relief that has to be billions, and the government can't even tell us how much it is. It is a scandal. An absolute scandal. You have similar, I mean, some of these figures, this is the, Count Corla, for those that are interested, this is the problem with this stuff, right? You have to get things like this off the Revenue website. Now, fair play to Revenue for producing these things, but look at the small print, it's tiny. But those are all the tax reliefs. Loads of them, right? But some of the ones just really jump out at you. Intra-group transactions is one of my favourites, Count Corla. That's transactions between one bit of one company and another bit of the same company. And guess the figure in the latest available figures is €9 billion in tax reliefs. €9 billion. The Controller and Auditor General has confirmed some of this stuff. We've been saying this for a few years, right? Controller and Auditor General brings out a report in the last few weeks where he says, such is the extent of tax relief. First of all, 90 of the richest people in Ireland whose average wealth is over €50 million a year are paying less tax than the average industrial worker, and he goes on to say the reason for this is because of a myriad of tax reliefs, deductions and allowances, which he estimates at being allowing 216 billion worth of profits not to be taxed at all. And he estimates that this could cost tax revenue of about 29 billion over the time of those over this tax relief. Now imagine what 29 billion would do for housing, for health, for education, for dealing with climate change. Just imagine. It's staggering what it would do, Count Corla. It would transform this country. But that's what's going. That is what is going on in the small print. Now, does this finance bill tackle any of this stuff? That's really the big question. I mentioned that the avoidance measure in the budget, the one avoidance measure, has a zero figure beside it. So it clearly doesn't do much in that regard. We have more tax reliefs in some areas. Some of them maybe we'll have to scrutinise these. Some of them may have merit. We're going to have them on gyms and childcare facilities in workplaces. Could be good, could be abused. So we need to think about these things. Of course, we want to make childcare cheaper and we want people to be fit, but we don't want executives, well-paid executives, essentially giving themselves free childcare and free, whatever you call gym stuff, right? I don't know what the technical term is, but it isn't available to ordinary people, but it's just a way of, again, writing off what is essentially an additional benefit to them. So it could be that. I don't know if it is. We'll have to scrutinise it. I'm sure the officials can help, but these things have to be looked at because you never know what could be in there. We're going to have wear and tear allowances on biogas vehicles. Could be good. An environmental measure, I hope. We're also going to have on energy efficient equipment, but let's remember the Renewable Heat Energy Initiative in the North and what that turned out to be, where you have all these people in the know going in buying loads of equipment to avail of the tax thing that they don't even need. Burning wood chip burners, which they didn't even need in order to actually benefit from the tax relief. So all of these things need to be scrutinised. I'm not saying there's problems, but we need to scrutinise these things. Now, I do want to say a good word about one thing, and there may be more things in this, but I want to say a good word about one thing. This is something that I've been campaigning on a lot, prompted by people in the film industry, is the work in here on the Section 481 tax relief. And I've raised this because this is another one of these reliefs, very generous relief, Count Corla, about €70 million a year, which is given to the film industry. Now, I'd like to see 140 million going in. In fact, in our budget submission, we put double the amount into arts, and a lot of it would go into film and obviously other art forms. But it has to be something that actually generates a real economic and social impact for the country if you're talking about that kind of money. And here I have raised very serious concerns, prompted by those in the industry, particularly workers in the industry, that in fact this tax relief was not properly being policed. and that the claims being made by a relatively small group of production companies who were getting the overwhelming majority of this tax relief about the levels of employment that were being generated as a result of this relief, which is presumably the point of the relief, Count Corla, were absolutely made-up figures. So they came into the Arts Committee. I'm not a member, but I went down to see what they had to say, and they said there were 17,000 jobs in the Irish film industry. Now that's a pretty good return, if that were the case, for 70 million, 17,000 jobs. But then you actually go around and talk to people working in the industry, and it turns out there isn't 17,000 jobs. There's not 7,000 jobs. There's not maybe even 3,000 jobs. There is maybe today, as we speak, about 700 people working in the industry, in reality. Okay? Because actually nobody has a permanent job in the film industry. The people who are getting the money are getting it through special purpose vehicles, where they essentially absolve themselves of any responsibility for their employees and have a hire them and fire them workforce, which they take on a project-to-project basis, but it is totally, totally precarious. Totally precarious. Now this is despite the fact that Section 481 relief requires, specifically in the Taxes and Consolidations Bill, requires, I quote, the provision of quality employment as a condition of benefiting from the tax relief. And in fact, you have the most precarious employment, or lack of employment, in the industry, even though it's getting €70 million worth of relief. That's not acceptable. I mean, gee, I could create more than 700 jobs with 70 million quid directly. If it's 17,000, you think, great. But if it's actually only about 700 and it's totally precarious and nobody has a permanent job, you think there's something problematic here, to say the least. And then you have allegations from Mel Gibson, and he's not the only one, by the way, in the last few weeks, confirming some of this stuff, saying that, now I don't know if it's true, it has to be investigated, but it's worrying, isn't it, if Mel Gibson says that Irish producer companies were abusing and artificially inflating their claims for expenses under this, which then are tax deductible and allow them to get more Section 481 tax relief, right? That's a serious problem. So this does tighten it up, I'm glad to say, Minister. Because there's been a focus on it. I've certainly spoken on several occasions in here. It was discussed in the Arts Committee and so on, and there's some attempt to address it. Now, there's a lot of detail, but I'm glad to see it. And it says things like, basically, Revenue will have the power to find out whether the conditions of the relief are actually being met by the film production companies. That has to happen. And by the way, just as an analogy, Count Corley, it's a bit like what was going on in the construction sector, and bogus self-employment and road builders employing people on a completely precarious basis, not paying taxes and so on. There's an analogy. In fact, there's some quite strong overlaps between what goes on in construction and what goes on in the film industry, particularly for many grades of workers. That has to be addressed. And by the way, I just want to say in response to what some of the producers say about this, and Screen Ireland, who tried to defend the status quo by saying, well look, film's just a precarious industry, that's the way it is, you don't understand, film is different. And I was chatting to somebody, I met him on the street, who is knowledgeable about animation. And you see in animation, because that's we have a big animation industry, they don't have precarious work. They don't. The films, it's based on films as well. But people have proper training, and then they get jobs in animation companies who then make movies. And that's episodic too. But it seems in animation we've got it right. And by the way, the standard of Irish animation is absolutely fantastic. Right? We're a serious player in terms of the big movie industry on an international scale. Has that anything to do with the fact that we've proper, secure, decent terms of employment for many of the people who work in the animation industry? So we need to link, in a very tight way, the public investment that is going into the film industry absolutely correctly, and we want to see more of that investment, much more, going in, because we have a massive pool of talent in this country, but you will not get the best out of that socially, in terms of employment, or in terms of proper treatment of workers, or even, I believe, in terms of the quality of film production, if you don't actually treat people properly and give them some sort of proper training structure. You know, if you go to the bother of learning about these often very technical, creative, difficult things to make films, you shouldn't have a precarious existence for the rest of your life. Now, I'm glad to see this bill is addressing some of those areas and other things that I haven't had time to go into in the film sector, and we'll scrutinise it more at the committee. But credit where credit's due. Most of the credit goes to film workers who've agitated about this, but I'm glad that the government seems to have listened on this particular issue.